My name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to my YouTube channel, The History Squad. Now today's video is all about the history of gin, the beginnings of gin, how it went from mother's ruin all the way through to the beautiful cocktails that we have today. Now, we're not in my basement studio, you've probably noticed. In fact, I'm very, very lucky to have an award-winning gin distillery right on my doorstep, Black Fox Distillery in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, right on the prairies of Canada. And the reason I'm here is this is a bit of a historical thing because we're going to turn a full circle of history. So let's get on the history of gin. So, the history of gin. Let's have a look at the origins. First of all, for gin, you need grain and juniper berries. Unless you're in China 4,000 years ago when they learned to distill spirit from rice. And then at the time of Christ, the birth of Christ, you have Maria. Now this is a legend, right? Maria, the Jewess, who had learned how to distill grain. Now this is where there is often a little bit of a complication because white grain spirit in history, simple grain, is often referred to as gin. But it's not true gin unless it has juniper in it. Just remember that a little bit, because the juniper itself is used in so many ways. The ancient Egyptians, they used it for all these different herbal tonics. They even used it when they did the embalming. Yeah, the Romans knew about it, the Greeks knew about it. But how about the Benedictine monks, 11th century, I think it was, in Salerno in southern Italy? They realized that this is actually a lovely tonic and it will help perk you up. And they started to record in Latin, of course, all of these secrets of the juniper and the spirits, aqua vita, the water of life. Yeah, this is one of the names. And then Pope John the 21st, mid-13th century, using white spirit, juniper, he had a tonic for washing your eyes, which I think is great because it will clear your eyes. But of course, if you put alcohol in your eyes, don't do that at home, please. It will actually get you a little bit drunk. But the guy who is actually accredited, and I come across so many complications when I was researching on this, Silvias de la Boa, 1572. He was a professor of alchemy, medicine and stuff. He is credited to actually distilling gin properly with the grain and with the juniper berries. However, as I'm reading it, somebody says, no, it wasn't him, it was Francois Sylvia. And I'm thinking, all right then, so it's the beginning. 1572, it's the full beginning of the distilling manufacture of gin in Europe. It's not called gin actually, it's called Genever, which is the Dutch word for gin. Interestingly, in the 17th century England, gin as we know it was medicinal. I do know that under the kingship of Charles I, he'd encouraged the manufacture, the distilling of gin. So it was getting a bit of a royal name to it there. And all over Europe, there were these gin-based drinks that were tonics. And one fascinating person is Nicholas Culpepper, still a famous name in apothecary to this very day. Just after the English Civil War, 1652, he has got it into his mind that medicine and the treating of illnesses, the knowledge of it should be available to everyone. He wrote a book called The English Physician about treating yourselves with things that grow in England. So, according to Nicholas Culpepper, things that can grow in the fields of England can cure various ailments, illnesses. I've got a list here, do excuse me reading it. Juniper can cure coughs, consumption, tuberculosis, cramps, shortness of breath. It's written down childbirth. So gin can cure childbirth. Actually, I should imagine that means a troubled childbirth, yeah, one that's painful. Memory, it can help improve memory. I will tell you this, if I have more than 2 gins, it doesn't help my memory. It can strengthen the optic nerves, cure sciatica, gout, and helps improve modern decrepitude. It's just great, isn't it? But that's how we learn through history, isn't it? But at this time, Holland and the Low Countries were becoming the experts in gin production, and that's the next part of our story. So, the Dutch connection, Holland, 1688, William of Orange. He was married to our King James's daughter. He was invited over. He brought an army of 21,000 troops, all of whom would be well familiar with a drop of Genever. So it's come across. Now, I don't know if William of Orange, when he became the king, William III and William and Mary, that era, if he drank gin, but what I do know is he did like to have a good drink with his courtiers and was often found unconscious drunk by the servants. So I reckon there was a bit of gin in there somewhere. So the 17th century and then going into the 18th century, they were blighted by some terrible wars. We'd had the 30 Years' War, we'd had the English Civil War, and then the Wars of the Spanish Succession. After these, there was an animosity between England and France. So the English government come up with the idea, let's tax French red wine. Let's tax brandy from France. Let's encourage people to drink Genever, gin. So there was increased production. People, patriotic, are going to drink more gin. But then as you get more demand for gin, there's more demand for grain. So the prices of grain begin to fluctuate. Meanwhile, the people are wanting more of this gin. And then the East India Company beats the Dutch East Indian Company into certain parts of India, so they can now bring with them exotic botanicals. They can add to the juniper. So now we have different kinds of gin that are coming out. But of course, the more you promote the consumption of the alcohol, the more problems you're storing up for the future. So what happened was there's more demand for gin, especially in the poor areas and the dock areas. Portsmouth, East End of London, Norwich as well. There were gin shops springing up. So you could just pop in and you could get yourself a jug of gin. Incidentally, this also led to bread shortages because the grain was being diverted and used in the process of distilling gin. Farmers make their own gin from what was left over crop of grain. But if they can make more money from gin, they will use more of their crop. So bread yields are lower, and therefore the person who owns the bread shop is not making as much money, doesn't have the supplies. This goes up and down until the gentry started to object because they were the farmers who were losing out on their grain crop for bread. And one magistrate, he describes how lawless London, the East End of London, was becoming, how men were literally drunk and aggressive in the street. And he called gin nothing more than a street drug. So this all led to the gin craze, the first half of the 18th century London. There were some other outbreaks, as I mentioned, Portsmouth, Norwich. The rest of the country seemed to be clear of the gin craze. It was centered on London. And you can understand it when you look at how people lived in the East End of London. It was diabolical. You could starve to death on the street. People would simply step over you. Mothers with children trying to work would have their babies looked after by a wet nurse, and the wet nurse would squirt gin into their mouths to keep them quiet. They call it a positive gin, which is gin mixed with milk to feed the babies. You had midwives who would come round to help with the birth, but these were gin-sodden old ladies. Poverty, starvation, disease led to crime, prostitution. The streets were disgusting, they were filthy, nobody seemed to care. And a one way out is a good drop of gin. Now, at that time, if you owned a brewery and you distilled gin, you had to have tables and chairs undercover, and you had to supply food as well, or have food on offer. But then you have your gin shops, the unscrupulous people who manufactured their own gin, but it wasn't gin. And as I said to you earlier on, gin has to have junipers. Yes, it's a grain-based alcohol, but to be gin, it has to have juniper berries. And some of those gin shops, the unscrupulous stills, There was no juniper berries in there. There was oil of turpentine, sulfuric acid, oil of almonds, ginger, pepper, to make it bite, fire water. Then they added sugar to it. So it was palatable to women. So you live in the East End of London, you have no hope. Your life is nothing but misery. But a good tot of gin, it'll lift you a little bit. You could purchase a pint of gin far cheaper than a pint of ale. The Middlesex magistrates were complaining so much about the brazen criminals. Something had to be done. It was by 1735, 6 million gallons of gin were being drunk in England every year. That's over 2 gallons per person. That means man, woman, and child. We had massive problems. The government, 1757, actually banned all illegal stills. They offered a £5 reward to anybody who would tell them where there was a still in operation. But if you did that, you might find yourself with your throat slit. These are tough times. But you then move over to the military, the Navy, Nelson's Navy, the Napoleonic Wars, end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s. Your sailors drank rum. They took lime juice to ward off scurvy. But the officers, Admiral Nelson, Lord Nelson and his men, they had oak barrels of gin. So I wonder, when they drank their gin in the mess deck and all of that kind of stuff, was it the same as this? We've got some here. Award-winning oak gin. Look at the colour. Yeah? So did Nelson have this oak-stained gin, just the same as this? History turning full circle, isn't it? I can imagine his men singing, oh, there's a nice gin and tonic and all of that kind of stuff, and his men drinking the old rum. But on the battlefield of Waterloo, you imagine the thousands of British soldiers looking down the hill as the tens of thousands of French soldiers are coming up the hill. Drums are beating, flags are waving, the cavalry, the artillery, and those British redcoats stood there. And then their sergeant comes along, dishing out a good mug of gin. And I love the line from the film The Battle of Waterloo, 1971, I think it was. And it's the Inniskilling Fusiliers. And they're stood there. And the sergeant's going, get this gin inside of you, because the French will have it out of you soon enough. It's Dutch courage, isn't it? Genever, gin. Eve of the battle, that Dutch drink. Dutch courage. I like that. But then through the Victorian times, there's a resurgence with the poverty going on in London of gins, yeah, the gin palaces, the gin shops. But all around the empire, you now have settlements of British government officials, shall we call them that, in the Raj in India. Of an evening time, they will have a gin and tonic. The gin for the juniper, the tonic for the quinine, for helping with malaria and night cramps. This whole thing is coming together. And then Singapore, 1915, the barman there, Magium Tong Boom. He puts a mixture of gin together, pineapple, lime, curacao, and Benedictine. It's a Singapore Sling. My wife, Julie, behind the camera there, she went to Raffles Hotel to the Long Bar and was really disappointed because they don't mix it fresh. They have it shipped in as a concentrate. Ah, what a disappointment. What fascinates me about being sat here in the centre of the Black Fox distillery is I'm surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands, of bottles of gin. And it was the British government, in its attempt to regulate the sale of gin, which forbade the selling of gin in casks. You could only sell it in a glass bottle. And I love that because I'm actually sat in the middle of a farm. Think about it. Black Fox Distillery, it's a farm. They grow flowers, they grow pumpkins. Then 90% of the ingredients they need for their award-winning gin. They also recycle so much stuff, all the mash from the grain. When it's finished with, it's put back into the ground as fertilizer. They recycle 95% of the water they use for the gin. I do wonder, does that make some of the flowers a bit drunk? Yeah, but anyway, their gin, their oak cask gin. So this is the stuff that Nelson would have drunk. It was the world's best cask gin for the World Gin Awards 2017. That's not bad for a place in the middle of the prairies, in the middle of Canada. Think about that. That's quite fantastic in my book. A local firm doing incredibly well on the world stage. So, when you look at everything I've put into this film, it would seem that gin, Genever, has actually turned full circle and come of age. Cheers. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, like, share and subscribe. And don't forget to turn on the all notification button, because you never know what kind of film, what kind of history film is coming down the line from the History Squad. But before I go, special mention to Black Fox Distilleries. We've had so much fun shooting on location. Now, if you're interested in any of their award-winning gins, there is a link in the description. So for now, bye and thank you very much.